and this is where we had the original idea to create this Sunlight Spectacle event as an edutainment event was through the organization that Adam is working with the Mandela family, also to disseminate both the message of Mr. Mandela and the message of Michael Jackson, to bring people together and awesome. Create better places.
Well, Lloyd, I researched sometimes after the meeting conversations are better than the meeting.
I know. It's like a party. It's like a long goodbye on the foyer after a party. I don't know if you guys have heard Freddie Mercury's song, "Is This the World We Created?"
I haven't, yes, but I'll look forward to that.
Yeah, it touches you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it touches you. And if anybody is born in November around, I think 28th is when Freddie was born.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I only learned afterwards that Freddie Mercury is of Asian descent. So I had no idea.
Yeah, and I'm from East Africa. I'm from Kenya.
Mm.
And you know what? Growing up with Michael Jackson, I actually met Michael Jackson when I was working at the airport. And he came off the plane and he covered himself and he was like, "Oh, there's people touching me." I didn't understand what OCD was until I came to Canada, and I go, "Oh, the poor guy was just having OCD." And a huge culture shock, by the way. So yeah, and Freddie is from Zanzibar, where my husband's family comes from. So I'm kind of feeling like I'm like a family feeling towards him. Luckily, they haven't tainted Freddie's name yet with some kind of God knows what.
Whatever. It's up to us to take it and make out of it what we choose.
But his song will touch you because it's so close to what we are saying actually in this meeting. Is this the world we created? It's crazy.
Well, we can create our own soundtrack too. So we can add whatever.
I love that, a playlist.
Yeah.
You know what? Have you thought about going live on YouTube? Because I just recently heard that YouTube is the biggest search engine right now. I didn't know that.
Well, yes and yes.
Next week.
Well, here's the idea. We can also upload the rebroadcast to YouTube. But yes, the short answer is yes.
You know, and if you hashtag things that the youth are looking at on that YouTube, we'll find them. The hashtag will find them.
All right, Fule,
they'll find us.
Fule, you hashtag us. She's young. She knows what I'm talking about. I don't know.
So we'll have to create hashtags, Fule, for what we're doing here.
Yes.
And we can track it and Twitter and all that stuff.
Right. I'll do that. I see the live that is going on Facebook, that page, you guys have already done a good job there by using some hashtags already.
Ooh.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Is James still here? James, are you there?
Yeah, I'm still here.
Yeah, James talked about you talked about the politics and how nasty it is. Well, you know, the colonial feedback that's going on in my country, in Canada. In Kenya. I come from Kenya. I now live in Canada. You know, when the government wants to do something new, they always go to Europe and ask the Europeans, "Oh, how did you do this?" And they don't know that the European mentality is now in their genes, and I'm going to teach you the right way to do it. And Kenya is now going through something called BBI, Building Bridges Initiative. But when you read that document, it is nothing about building bridges between the tribes, between the leading parties, between leaders, between the gap between the youth and there's no bridge. It's just gaping hole. It's like a crater, or bigger than the Rift Valley that we live in. And nobody is reading the document because we kind of feel, oh, we voted. It should be okay.
Right. So, Hasnin, when you talk, I remember when Gaddafi was killed. I was doing my master's in Belgium at the time. And the mainstream media, it was published everywhere. Sorry, it was published everywhere on the media that they are tracking down a dictator. They are, yes, somebody who has been an enemy to the whole entire world. They are tracking him down, and it was total jubilation when that guy was killed in Belgium there. And I asked myself, what is happening? Okay, so the mainstream media has really been used very differently. Yeah.
So Kevin, you had your hand raised, Kevin. Did you want to say something, Kevin?
Yeah. You know, I wanted to just say briefly that, you know, I like to expand upon the narrative about climate, because for 30 years, we've seen Al Gore, the self-professed inventor of climate change, or the discoverer of climate change, you know, for 30 years, you take a look at that, you know, and also the neoliberal context of what groups like that do. And, you know, I watched again, connected to climate, I watched Greta Thunberg start her drive for Fridays for Future. I was lucky to follow her very, very early. I'm familiar with Autumn Peltier's work as a water ambassador. I can't remember exactly what their term is, but she's a water ambassador for all of Canada. Also an Indigenous youth girl. So I watched that happening in 2019, late 2018, early 2019, as Extinction Rebellion was also starting within the UK, another action group that was climate related. And then, so I watched that, and I'm a trajectory guy and a momentum guy. And I watched those two entities come across Canada, if you will, where Greta came by sailboat to have as small an impact environmentally. When she got to Turtle Island, she was received by the Indigenous community, and she was here for, I think, maybe 2 weeks, and she left Turtle Island on her way to COP25, I think. And, you know, Al Gore didn't mention her name one time for the whole time that she was on her way over here, and so the whole time she was here. And then it wasn't until she left Turtle Island that he muttered her name. You know, like at the time, the most significant growing momentum within youth and climate, like he didn't say anything. You know, the marketer of climate change let a superpower, youth, come and go and didn't say a word. Now that was 2 years ago. And most recently, Jane Fonda, who started her own social discussion movement, youth movement narrative called Fire Drill Fridays, supposedly inspired by Greta Thunberg. Jane Fonda started this Fire Drill Fridays with live events every Friday. Like after Greta had come and gone, she started her thing. But what happened this past January, or whenever it was that she stood on stage at the Golden Globes in front of 350 million people, likely the very last time she'll have such a live audience. And she said zero about Fire Drill Fridays, zero about climate change. So that is an example of colonial-minded behavior, and the colonial mindedness that's that's woven in the system, right? And because they're doing work, but not enough or just enough to keep the distraction and to perpetuate the distraction that is the colonial-minded narrative, right? That distract people from what's happening so that they can continue to do it. Think of UBI, if I can. I want to add this UBI. Think of that, the context of it. We, in the first world, are talking about universal basic income, which is great because everyone gravitates to that narrative because it makes sense. But in true colonial, because a universal basic income for the first world that will rely on the existing globalized supply chain that's 100% reliant on marginalized labor will allow, UBI will allow that to grow in the context of how it's set up. It's set up on marginalized labor. It's set up on marginalizing Mother Earth, because when we manufacture in offshore foreign markets and we export from there to the first world, there's added CO2 that gets added to the cost of those products and the cost of to the earth, right? This is all the colonial-minded trajectory, right? And I just wanted to share that because no one seemingly gives a shit, pardon my language, about the climate. Because for 30 years, there's been limited progress within that. And it's all now a redirection of what's needed, which is huge, very, very significant adaptations and preparations for the reality of what's called the tipping points of climate change. And I highly recommend a video that was put out yesterday by Extinction Rebellion, Roger Hallam. That's a 2-hour video specifically speaking to youth as they prepare for how to live within the potential annihilation. That's coming Kevin, from climate reality and the tip.
Well, Kevin, if you could copy the link and put it into the chat, those of us that have an ability to do so can actually see that video. But I do want to say that in the chat, I've also put in the United Nations Global Compact local network strategy. 3 things, Kevin. In 2012, even though the world didn't end as the Mayans had predicted, we did enter what's called an extinct level event horizon. So the entire Earth now is shifted its, I guess you'd call it its metabolism, so to speak. And it's up to us human beings to adapt, because if the world, if all human beings died tomorrow, the Earth would still be here. But what are we going to do about us being here? So it was Kofi Annan. He was the Secretary General of the United Nations in 2000, when in fact the Millennium Development Goals were founded. But you may not remember, it was in 1999 that the world had come together to address systemic racism and to do debt relief for the African countries. That was the foundation of what we now know as the Millennium Development Goals, because the United States and Israel decided that they would veto that movement. But Kofi Annan was the first sub-Saharan African Secretary General. There at the beginning of the Millennium Development Goals. So in 1999, he actually appeared at the Davos World Economic Forum and introduced this concept of the United Nations Global Compact, because he could see in Africa the adverse impacts of major corporations and their tainting and destruction of the environments in the areas where they were working. What he did was he created a companion organization called the United Nations Global Compact. The idea was to get corporate multinational corporations to make a voluntary commitment to be socially conscious and effect to create what's called a corporate social responsibility organization. There were 44 corporations that started then. That's grown now to over 12,000. They were addressing human rights, including indigenous rights, labor, the environment, and they later added anti-corruption. Because as you may know, right now, there are like $60 billion of remittances that come from around Africa going into the country, but there's $144 billion of illicit money flows out of the country, out of the continent, into Europe and the United States and major multinational corporations. So the issues that we're faced with, Kevin, I think empowers us to use the framework that they put into place that we can use by numbers to change the game. The idea is that the commitment I've made is to add another 10,000 what they call civil society organizations. That includes not just non-governmental organizations and nonprofits and faith-based organizations, but also educational institutions, labor associations, business associations, and even cities and municipalities. And the idea, Kevin, is that we can win by numbers. On a grassroots campaign, we have more numbers than them. Okay, I see your finger raised, go right ahead.
Can we take can we take those connections and can we unify and plan a work-back strategy, a work-back schedule for an international general strike? Question.
Yes. Well, yes, yes, and yes. Mm-hmm. The whole idea is that, as Lloyd mentioned to you, this concept that this AHIABGA Ad Hoc International Advisory Board of Goodwill Ambassadors, activists, and advocates, the idea was not just to add new members to the United Nations Global Compact. And by the way, they're broken down into what they call local networks. If you look at a map right now of all the local networks of the United Nations Global Compact, where they have the least number in those countries, Kevin, where there's the most likely chance that people will die from the adverse effect of climate change, right? So part of the strategy is for us to populate this framework and expand the existing networks into those areas now where there aren't any. And the idea is that, for example, here in the United States, we only have 793 members of the Global Compact. Obviously, if we add 1,000 members, that's going to be a major difference. But the idea is that we don't join as individuals, we join as a united group. And the idea is that we empower ourselves by being responsible for not just holding accountable the multinational corporations, but to also plan and manage and grow our own network so that we can, yes, not just call a strike, but we can be the strike if we so choose. I'll put a pin in it there and open the floor back up.
Before I forget, I just want to mention something about the Fridays for Futures and the climate strikes and those things that the youth did when Greta Thunberg actually visited Turtle Island. Not to forget that, because that is actually ongoing at the grassroots. That was started an initiative out of Bermuda, the crossroads of the Atlantic. And in Bermuda, what they're doing is what's called the Fridays for Future Forgiveness, where especially the mothers, together with the youth, are marching in the streets and showing solidarity. And so I should introduce you all, especially to Corin Smith in Bermuda, who's leading that charge and is part of our network. And I think that could be something that we could follow up after we have our meetings every Thursday. We have solidarity events in our own communities every Friday to mark our solidarity with the youth and the Fridays for Future Forgiveness movement.
Well, I can speak on that a little bit because it was actually Corin Smith and myself that launched that campaign. But before that, back in 2012, when I visited Bermuda, and also just to let you know, James, it was Hong Kong in 1997. That was the last country that was decolonialized from the British Empire. It's Bermuda that's scheduled to be the next country that's set up for decolonialization. They brought in, after they had an all-white government in Bermuda up to 1998. And in 1998, there was an all-black government that came in. Their responsibility to the people was to take Bermuda independent. But just as you mentioned, the neo-colonialists decided that no, they're going to still stick it out. But it is, in fact, the youth that are driving our initiatives. So I'm going to take just a minute and just to let us all know, language is so important, Kevin. And so what I'm suggesting is that we use the language of, quote, the oppressors, so to speak, in terms that James would understand. But in other words, let's use the language that they're using. One of the terms they use is this idea of the Sustainable Development Goals. That's most of the countries in the world, they know about that. The ones that don't know about it are the ones that Lloyd or has been spoken of as the developed world. But it's us here in the United States, for example, that are facing the very same problems that you find around the world. So let me take a moment here. I'm going to share this video. It's just 2 minutes and then we'll pick back up. Let's see here. So in the chat, I'm going to also put a link to it. It's just 2 minutes about the Sustainable Development Goals. And it's done in a fashion that the youth can understand because it's the one, they produced it. Vocabulary, ARY, 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Development Goals.
I like the caveat, something the youth will understand, because they're really stupid. They don't speak the same language in my own house.
I wanted to mention the organization that our colleague Adam Greenwell is working with as an ambassador in New Zealand is called Generation Hip Hop. And I don't have the link here to put into the chat, but it's definitely something I will share with the group afterwards.
Well, again, I introduced Adam to Terrence Berry and to Ndaba Mandela, and I was responsible for him being in part of the Generation Hip Hop. So I'll put in the link there, Lloyd. That's not a problem.
I'm trying to create a dictionary, but I think it'll be obsolete by the time it goes in print, because simple things like put the dishes away means hide them under your bed.
From the kids directory, from the kids dictionary.
If I can just, I just wanted to wrap up. I left this one thought, and I'm 1 minute to wrap it up.
Okay, sure. Let me stop sharing. Yes.
If I can.
Yes, go right ahead.
The UBI, just very quickly, and I can just be by volume. The UBI being a colonial-minded distraction is what I was trying to just wrap up and say, that as much as UBI makes sense, it really can't be at the expense of the existing setup, which is reliant on enslaved, marginalized labor. So what's really needed is a universal basic lifestyle. And by talking about a universal basic income, it's a colonial design distraction that is just enough, but not enough. And I just wanted to make sure that I wrapped that up. Sorry about that. Thanks for.
Oh, certainly. No problem at all. We're on our own time, and I think it's very important. All I'm asking you to do, Kevin, is to come up with solutions. What I'd like for us to do is talk about anything, but anything we talk about, come up with a solution or strategy, and then let's work on it, because we all either know what the problem is or we're part of the problem ourselves. So let's take the responsibility for going ahead and doing something about it. I'd be happy to work with you on that whenever you say, Jim and Kevin. No problem.
Hi. Hello.
Yes, go right ahead.
Can you hear me? Oh, I apologize. You went off to another subject completely, and the ladies were saying something previous. I'm trying to hold it in my mind. One about the idea of going to Europe, to asking the Europeans how to do things properly. They weren't going to Europe to get information. They were going to Europe to get their pockets filled. okay, and to take direction from the masters.
Oh my God, you're so right.
When
Oh my
René
You
Lévesque
know
came
this.
into office in when René Lévesque came into office in 1976 for the PQ party, it was a big revelation. Hey, French this, French that. Nothing wrong with French. Francophone people, it's not them. It's the politicians that want to have power. Anyways, long story short, about a year later, he was in the prime minister. Yeah, he was in Trudeau's office, and he was presented with a very large suitcase, and he was asked, "Look, keep the separatist movement moving, but don't actually separate." He walked away a very rich man. So all of René Lévesque's rhetoric about separation, Quebec, everything else was crap because he had no intention of doing it because he was paid off. I got that from the secretary that was Prime Minister Trudeau's secretary at the time. So you see, and then Gaddafi. Okay, I actually had tea in Libya, and Gaddafi came and met me. So actually, I was talking with him for a few minutes, not very long. Okay, very tall, very lean man, he had curly hair back then. But we left as friends. Okay, put it that way. So if you need help, give me a call. Well, he needed help in 2011. I actually attempted to go there prior to his assassination. The idea is I was trying to get him to become the grandfather of his nation, not the father, as he kept on talking about himself. He was now a grandfather. Had he done that, I think he'd be alive today. I know he'd be alive today. But he was murdered because he was taking away the almighty American petrodollar and replacing it with their gold-based currency. And America doesn't have gold to deal with. America sets in all kinds of gold, but belongs to everybody else. It doesn't belong to the States. It belongs to every other nation but the States. So they didn't want the American dollar to be devalued to the brink of wallpaper. So they had to do something. So they got rid of him. Again, colonialism, the banksters. This is the Federal Reserve talking about. So it goes very deep. The rabbit hole is deep, and I've been to the bottom, and I've worked my way up, and I've seen too much as it is. So there is some comments.
Great. Well, Fule, you had your hand raised. You wanted to make a comment, Fule? No? Okay. Well, just a comment.
That would be a mistake. Sorry.
No worries. Yeah, Jim, well, in that same regard, as you may or may not know, it was Gaddafi, his idea of the United States of Africa, that actually converted or changed or helped to change the Organization for African Unity that was founded in 1963 to deal with anti-colonialism on the continent, that was reshaped by Gaddafi in 2002 to actually build a unified Africa that disregarded the arbitrary lines that were drawn in the 1885-1884 Berlin Conference that subdivided the continent of Africa to the benefit of the colonialists. So for example, the Francophone group of nations in Africa, they were all established to benefit the country of France. So they did not allow or permit any interaction with the group of countries right next to them that were, let's say, all colonialized by the Portuguese, including countries like Angola. And so what the intent of Gaddafi was for there to be a United States of Africa, which now on January 1st, may be closer to coming into being in realization through the African Continental Free Trade Area. That's one of 12 flagship projects that the African Union has devised in what they call the African Union Agenda 2063. That was articulated by Madam Zuma back in 2012, looking back from 2063 to see what steps needed to be taken for Africa to achieve the 7 aspirations that they had developed. So it was also in 2012 that the United Nations was in the last part of what they call the big push. they had set out the Millennium Development Goals for a 15-year plan. By 2010, they realized they weren't going to hit it. So they created what they call the Big Push. And instead of the 8 goals being developed by a handful of people in the bottom of the basement of the United Nations, they opened up the entire world to contribute to what now is the Sustainable Development Goals. Africa had already devised, as part of their plan, what they call the Common African Position on the Post-Millennium Agenda, which is now what we know as the Sustainable Development Goals. So Africa is the largest regional bloc that has input into what the Sustainable Development Goals are. The other thing they did was I'll get right back to you, James. The other thing they did was they opened up a worldwide survey. So they had over 3 million people to contribute to what these 17 Sustainable Development Goals are and 169 targets. But for the African Union, getting back to that, they had not just 12 flagship projects for the continent, but what they call 5 diaspora legacy projects. And that's where Fule comes in and all the other people that are from those African countries. However, there are 55 African countries, 54 of them are members of the African Union. Each one of those has what they call a diaspora ministry. They're responsible for connecting together the dots with the people outside the continent with those on the continent. My supposition is that we here in what they call the 6th region of the African Union, because you have 5 on the continent, but those like myself that are born outside, we have the obligation to do what we can to make sure we connect those dots. So I'll turn it back over to you, James, but Fule, the point is that we have a framework that we can use. The idea is that we have strength in numbers, and rather than leave it to the politicians, I say let us be the ones that actually accomplish what they claim that needs to be done. And then we can, I hope, attract some of the trillions of dollars that are going to be spent to accomplish what they call the Sustainable Development Goals. It was pegged at $1.5 trillion a year, James. They were going to spend between last year and 2030. After the pandemic, they raised that to $2.5 trillion. So the meeting today with the G7 countries are just what Lloyd is talking about. They're figuring out how to spend money to accomplish not just climate adaptation, but also a way going forward that might include universal basic income, as we're going to be experimenting with here in the city of Los Angeles. But I'll put a pin in that now, and James, turn it back over to your commentary.
Much. Your knowledge is impeccable.
Yeah.
Congratulations. You have
so accurate.
That's what I like to see. I like that. Okay, and it's when that gets lost in the shuffle that it bothers me. They bury the paperwork. They bury the truth under a bunch of garbage. But there is one big fear about the whole African issue. And it's not about Africa. It's the Chinese government, its input into Africa. I told you the Chinese are indigenous people. They are. But just as in our case, where we have band councils that are loyal to the so-called colonialists, you have African people that are loyal to the colonialists and their pocketbooks. And in this case here, you're exchanging Europe for the Chinese government, okay? Which is kind of insidious because you all know the new banking system put together BRICS, okay? Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. You don't hear about them anymore. There's a lot of quiet going on. Then you find out that all these COVID breakouts and all these pandemic, the hardest hit areas are these nations. I wonder why. So it's not the Chinese that I fear in Africa. It's the Communist Party that you have to be careful of in Africa, because you can lead yourself from one trench to another in a very short while without realizing it. And they always come in as your friend. Whenever I talk to somebody from overseas, I tell them, I say, welcome, my friend. I'm not your friend. I don't know you. That will come with time. And that's how I developed friendships overseas, because I came in being truthful. I'm not your friend. Okay? I could be, but I could also not want to bother with you. And I've done that with people too. So you know where you stand. But it's like, oh, go ahead.
Well, yeah, two things. One, you follow the money, right? So China in the last 10 years has invested the bulk of their money in the first 7 years of that 10-year span. But you'll find now that what China has done is they've come in and they've brought in the infrastructure development for these countries in Africa, but they've imported their own people to be the ones that actually handle the management and operation of it. So much like the neo-colonialists, they are sitting in a position where they're controlling all of the outcome and output. And then the people that finish, when they finish their jobs, they don't go back to China. They actually set up local sales and manufacturing hubs from the major Chinese infrastructure. So they're refusing to allow there to be development of the country itself. But it is in fact up to the leadership of Africa to address that problem. And it is now, I think Fule will agree with me, the younger generation now are replacing the older generation, but it's going to take numbers to make that difference. So I'm working, just to let you know, Fule, let me see here, name-wise, left now. But in Kenya, there's a group called the Center for African Volunteers. It's headed up by Josephat Moses. So last year, he devised what he called 365 days of civic engagement. And the idea was to first engage with the youth and let them know what their human rights are, but also, James, their civil rights. And the idea that they would be the ones to understand how politics works so they could replace their local representatives that didn't represent them to actually be the ones that are standing up on the stage to make these decisions at the governmental level. The other group I'm working with in Nigeria called Jet Age, they have a continental-wide movement to do the same thing, James, to make sure that the local conditions are in the hands of people locally. So looking forward to continue this conversation with you.
Hi. Yeah. There is a simple solution. Simple. Nothing is simple, but it's done sometimes. It's a danger to other outside companies, but it's forewarning. You nationalize all the Chinese businesses. They become African. Totally. And you can hire Africans, you can hire whoever you want to by nationalizing it. Now, that says other corporations, well, they're going to nationalize us, so we're not going to come into Africa. Africa doesn't need anybody else. Just like Turtle Island, we don't need foreign investments. We have all the resources we need. We have plenty. No, it's the globalists that want the corporations all over the world controlling bits here, bits there. So if if the different nations in Africa nationalized, each one nationalized, like Kenya, for example, all these corporations, there'd be no takeover. And you'd be richer for it because now you control the corporation that came in and you can turn it into a sustainable company. Too simple, maybe.
Mm-hmm. Except you need the leaders of those countries to be on board, and most of them are captured already by the moneyed interests.
Yep, that's why the new people coming up.
Not sure if you're talking to us, Andrew, or not.
If I take myself off mute, you can probably hear me, huh?
Yeah.
I just wanted to say that now it's about 11 o'clock. I do have to take off in about a couple of minutes. So I'm going to have to wrap this up, but I do want to thank everyone for being here. Again, if you save the chat before we leave, you can follow up the notes. And Lloyd, I'll make sure I'll get the recording to you and you can share it with everyone else. I'll let it go that way. And Fule, I'll put my contact information in the chat, so maybe on WhatsApp we can connect and follow up.
And Jim, just I guess as we close out, we will be having this every week. So if you have more thinking, we'll have lots of opportunities to have exchanges over the next year. But if you want, just final few words.
I'll send you a format.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you for joining us, our queen.
I'm so glad I was able to do this. This was one of the important events that I wanted to do this year. Thank you all.
Bye.